Alrighty then. And Brother Johnstone asked me, I guess earlier today, I don't keep track of hours and days anymore. um, if I'd be able to minister and teach today. And this is something that's been on my heart. And so I was able to say, yes, absolutely. I'd like to talk about this. Um, and then just as Brother Johnstone was speaking, talking about praying to the east, to the west, the north, and the south, and praying that Satan's kingdom would come down. Um, that's so much in line with what I'm going to talk about here tonight that I just felt the confirmation on that. And I appreciate when the Lord does that sort of thing. Um, we live in some very unique times. And this is not necessarily prophecy teaching, but it feels to me like prophecy teaching. If it becomes prophecy teaching, I've missed it. But it might still be something you can get. But it's not prophecy teaching in the sense that I'm going to try to tell you about something that's going to happen. I have a feeling that sometimes we miss the fact that we live in the prophetic because we're looking for something to trigger prophecy for us. And we think, oh, what's the prophetic event that will let us know that God has suddenly clicked the clock, started the schedule, and now prophecy is being fulfilled. We have been in the prophetic since the days of Adam and Eve. And God's prophetic working is going on in this world generation after generation, and for us day by day. And we need to be aware of where we're at and what our generation has to do to fight the battle, to be successful against the enemy in this place in the prophetic scheme of things. What worked? Well, let me say this. What worked before will always work. But what tricks were tried to make things happen won't work anymore. Every generation, every group tries to come up with some gospel hack, if I can put it that way, to kind of short circuit, what God intended us to do. And gee, maybe if we just buy buses, we don't have to share the gospel with our neighbors, or maybe if we have a TV program, we don't have to invite people to church, some kind of a get around, to avoid, what actually does work. But in this time that we're living in, we need more than ever to be doing what God intends us to do, as opposed to just something else that might work for a congregation somewhere else. Um, I want to talk about two systems. In our world, there are two separate and diverse systems that are at work all the time, and they have been at work going back to the beginning. And and I'm not going to try to put a name on it other than there's that system of Abraham, if I can call it that. And then there is the system of Babylon. These two systems are parallel systems on our planet. And I'll show you what I mean as I get into this. From the time when Noah, his wife, and three kids, grown men, got out of the ark and climbed down Mount Ararat, God has given to them a work that they are to accomplish, and that is to replenish this planet with the human race and to bring to this planet a righteous people that would be different than those that were destroyed during the flood. That was the purpose of Noah finding grace in the eyes of the Lord. He was a righteous man. But as soon as they got down off the mountain, down into the plain, they began to build a city and a structure, which we all know to be the Tower of Babel. And God saw what they were doing and realized that this was rebellion and that it must be stopped because it would somehow change the purpose and the plan of God for the whole planet if they were successful with this city and this tower. And God confounded their languages and sent them off in different directions. We're not going to spend time on all the directions that they went, but we're going to look at the directions of two groups. One of them would be the group that ultimately became the family of Abraham. And the other, I'm just going to call the group that still had Babylon in their heart and in their mind. You see, when God changed their languages, he didn't change their mind, and they didn't change their heart. And when they went away from that place and the unfinished tower, they still had the same intents and purposes that they had before. And so the group that left from Babylon ultimately started to do again in different locations what they had tried to do previously. And I want to say the Babylonian system or Babylon is foundational to our human society today. What was happening in Babel is still being worked out today. It didn't take long for these people to leave the well-watered plains between the Tigris and Euphrates River to where they came across a place called Egypt. And there they began their building programs again. And we find that as the peoples of the earth with Babylon in their hearts and their minds traveled, they began to build these type of structures. You can find these structures throughout the world. You can find them in India. You can find them in China. You can find them on the islands of Indonesia, where my wife is from. You can find them in Central America and South America. We are tower builders because that is symbolic very much of what we are trying to accomplish as we build our cities and our societies. We can say that construction on the tower has never really stopped. What we are doing today as a human family is we are building these towers. And you see them even in our cities with our skyscrapers. Why is it there's such an obsession for the world's tallest building? You go to Dubai and they're building a mile tall, like, okay, that's, I guess, pretty impressive. What is that all about? Well, it really has a foundation based on rebellion. They don't want to do what God intended them to do. False religion, the social structure that comes with the Babylonian system, and they also have their own economy. And these features of Babylon and the people that went out from Babel with a changed language, but not a changed mind, have been putting their system into place throughout our world. That's why John was able to say that all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life, these things are not of the Father, and these things will pass away. Where do they come from? Well, we can trace them all the way back to when Noah and his sons got down off the mountain. And actually, you'll find that Babylon is tied to Lucifer. If we go to the book of Isaiah, chapter 11, a prophecy is given that thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how hath the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. Yea, the fir trees rejoice at thee. the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since thou art laid down, no feller is come up against us. Hell from beneath is moved for thee, to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It hath raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. Too often we take this particular portion of scripture and we apply it to something in the distant past and say that there was rebellion in heaven and that Satan, Lucifer, was cast down. But I want you to know that even though he was kicked out of heaven, he didn't change his plan. He still says, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will ascend into heaven. I will sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. And he manifested that spirit. Look at the beginning of that prophecy in the king of Babylon. I'd like to look at the book of Daniel, prophecy here in the book of Daniel concerning something he saw in a vision where he was standing at the seaside. I saw in my vision by night, behold, the four winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea. And four great beasts came up from the sea, different or diverse, one from another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. When he saw this beast coming up out of the sea in this vision, the historian part of me wonders, was this already the emblem and the image of Babylon? And God was using that existing image to speak to Daniel? Or because Daniel was friends with King Nebuchadnezzar and he spoke to the different rulers, he was in a position of authority. Did they take this vision and turn it into a national emblem? It's the which came first, the chicken or the egg argument, I guess. Regardless, this is the emblem of Babylon. It's a lion with eagle's wings. And that is the first great beast that came up out of the sea. It was like a lion and it had eagle's wings. And this is Babylon. This is their symbol. What we're seeing here is something archaeologists have dug up while they excavate the ancient city of Babylon. Babylon is the head of the Gentile empires that have oppressed Israel for the last 2,500 years. Babylon is in opposition to the plan and purpose of God as manifest in the system of Abraham. As I mentioned at the beginning of the study, there are two systems at work in our world today. There's this Babylon system, and there is the system of Abraham. And the Babylon system got power and authority over the Abraham system 2,500 years ago when Israel was taken into captivity. Jeremiah prophesied of this, and it happened during his lifetime. And as Jeremiah is talking about the destruction that's coming to the nation of Israel and Judah, and to the city of Jerusalem, look at what he says. I will bring disaster from the north and great destruction. And how does he describe Babylon? The lion has come up from his thicket, and the destroyer of nations is on his way. The Bible says, your adversary, as a roaring lion, goes about seeking whom he may devour. And Isaiah, in the prophecy we've already read, says, take up this parable against the king of Babylon, Lucifer. The destroyer of nations is on his way. He's gone forth from his place to make your land desolate. Your cities will be laid waste without habitation. Do not think that Satan and the Babylonian system is designed to build up a wonderful world with a future. It is designed to make the land desolate, make our cities waste. He is the destroyer of nations, and he's on his way. Babylon is the golden head of the Gentile empires. And again, Daniel gives us this revelation from his amazing book. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, had the dream, and I'm not going into the details. Like I said, this is not a prophecy lesson. This is a lesson to help us understand an existing system that's in our world, and it's been in our world going back from the days of Noah. And it's really energized and powered by the rebellion of Satan that goes all the way back into the prehistory of humanity when he was cast down from heaven, but he began his dirty work here on earth. This was the dream. Now I will tell your majesty what it means. Your majesty, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, you are the greatest of all kings. The God of heaven has made you emperor and given you power and might and honor. He has made you ruler over all the inhabited earth and ruler over all the animals and birds. You are the head of gold. And as Daniel began to explain to the king of Babylon the image of this person, this statue that he saw, the head of the statue was golden. And he said, that's you. And I like the wording in this particular revelation that Daniel had, because Satan is the power behind this system, but he did not wrestle this from God. Devil can't have anything that God doesn't allow him to have. And so even as Nebuchadnezzar and Satan were building this powerful, destructive empire, God says, I gave it to you. Don't forget that. And so here we see these two systems as they are parallel and interacting with each other from the time of Daniel, Ezekiel, and the prophets. Israel and Judah went into captivity. Judah was in Babylonian captivity under the head of gold, and they returned 70 years later under the ministry of Ezra and Nehemiah, but they never got their kingdom back. At that point, they were under the Medes and the Persians, which is shown as the arms and chests of silver. But the head of gold never went away. It's never said that this statue lost its head. It's just as different portions of the statue are revealed, we see that it goes from gold to silver to brass. The value goes down. And the brass would be under the Greeks, Alexander the Great, the Macedonian. Finally, the Romans, the legs of iron. It was during that time when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but they were under the control of Rome. They didn't have their own kingdom. They didn't have the kingdom of David. There was not anyone from the lineage of David sitting on the throne of David. So we see during the time of the reign of these empires, of these kingdoms with a head of Babylon, that the Jewish people will be under subjection to them. Let's go back to where we began. Noah and his family come down from the mount. Descendants begin to build a tower off to do what we just studied about, go the people with Babylon in their heart. But then there's another group, and they are the family and the followers of Abraham. Abraham was called out of Babylon, out of Ur of the Chaldees. God said, you've got to leave that place, and I'm going to put you in a land that I will show you, and I will make of you a nation. I will give you a son. Look at the stars of heaven, if you can count them. And so Abraham, by faith, went out and began a completely different system on this planet. And ultimately from that was the people of Israel. And they did eventually go into the land. We read about this in the Old Testament under Joshua, Judges, the Kings, Chronicles, all of that. We see how that eventually they failed in the calling that God had intended for them. And they went into that judgment that we discussed when Babylon came and took them captive. And they left the land, and they never had ownership, never was able to set up again the kingdom of David, the throne of David, up until 1948, when they became a sovereign nation once again. But they still have a long way to go. For 2,500 years, the Jews have wandered the earth. And these two systems have been at work on this planet. A group of vagabonds without a home, hated how many times through persecution, pogroms, and the Holocaust have they been tried to be destroyed by Satan, but he was not able to wipe them out. Let's go back. Abraham also had a secondary group. From Abraham, we know that Israel, which I have shown here as by the temple, there was another group, and it is the followers of the Messiah, Jesus the Christ, and his church, also from Abraham. Now, I want to stop here just a moment, and I want to do a little side Bible study here to help us understand the place of the church in relation to Israel during this time. Israel in the church is a lot like a plant where a grafting has taken place. And if Brother Schoonover was here, I'd probably turn it over to him at this point and have him explain how you can cut a branch off of one tree and graft it into another. This is very much the condition and the position of we Gentile believers in the tree with the trunk that I would call Abraham. Israel is the natural. The Gentile believers have been grafted in. Paul says this in Romans 11. Some of the branches of the cultivated olive tree have been broken off, and a branch of a wild olive tree has been joined to it. That's you. You are the wild olive tree. You Gentiles are like that wild olive tree. And now you share the strong spiritual life of the Jews. We are nurtured by what the Jewish people gave us in the Old Testament and in the prophecies and ultimately in the Messiah and in salvation that has been granted to us because we were grafted in. You Gentiles are like the branch of a wild olive tree that is broken off and then, contrary to nature, is joined to a cultivated olive tree. The Jews are like this cultivated tree. And look at this. It will be much easier for God to join these broken off branches to their own tree again. Sometimes people say it's going to be hard for the gospel to reach the Jews. Not according to Paul. It's going to be easier for the Jews to receive Jesus Christ as the Messiah once they lose their blindness. There is a secret truth, my friends, which I want you to know, for it will keep you from thinking how wise you are. It is that the stubbornness of the people of Israel is not permanent, but will last only until the complete number of Gentiles comes to God. Look at this. God has a plan and a purpose for the church, and that is to bring in to the kingdom a completed number. I don't know what that number is, but once God says, that's it, it's done. That's enough. And so what is going to happen at that point? Let's take a look at this plant or this grafting process. This is how it's done. A sprout, a branch is cut, it's tapered, it's stuck into a wound of the tree, and then it's bound up and it grows as if the root and the trunk was its own. In this same section of Romans, Paul explains how some Jews like himself believed, yet others did not. Paul explains how the non-Jew has been grafted into the vine, but this does not mean Israel has been discarded. Israel is in the plan of God, yet still. We continue. I say then, has God cast away his people? God forbid. For I'm an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away his people, which he foreknew. Even so then at this present time, also there is a remnant according to the election of grace. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid. But rather through their fall, salvation has come unto the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. Now, if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? Blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. There's going to come a time when the fullness of the Gentiles has been completed. Israel is going to then begin to see. What's going to happen is this tree with us over on the side is going to suddenly become aware that we're not the only thing growing from the trunk. And I believe that this began in 1948 when Israel became a nation. But that's nothing compared to what's going to happen. God's going to do a work among the Jewish people. What about us? Does it offend you if I say we'll go away? Let's take a look at Abraham. Israel. This is the prophecy. Prophesy to the land of Israel. Tell the mountains, hills, brooks, and valleys that I, the sovereign Lord, am saying in jealous anger because of the way the nations have insulted and humiliated them. I, the sovereign Lord, solemnly promise that the surrounding nations will be humiliated. But on the mountains of Israel, the trees will grow again leaves, bear fruit for you. My people Israel, you are going to come home again. I'm on your side. I will make sure that your land is plowed again. Your crops are planted on it. I will make your population grow. You will live in the cities and rebuild everything that was left in ruins. Okay, so here we see the parallel system that we have on this earth. We have the Babylonian system building up a kingdom that Satan actually offered to Jesus. He said, you fall down and worship me, I'll give you all of this. Jesus said, no, that's not my kingdom. When Jesus was asked, where is your kingdom? He says, oh, my kingdom is not of this earth. Now let's go into the book of Revelation. John says, I stood upon the sand of the sea. When Daniel had his vision, he said, I was standing at the sea and I saw something rise up out of the sea. John saw the same thing. I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. Both John and Daniel saw maybe not exactly the same thing at the same time frame in the scope of what God's doing on this planet, but they both saw this beast coming up out of the sea. There are 6 references to Babylon in the book of Revelation. I'd like to look at them. And there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And the great city was divided into 3 parts. The cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. And a mighty angel took a stone like a great millstone, cast it onto the sea, saying, Thus with violence shall that great city Babylon be thrown down, and it shall be found no more at all. This is the one system. It's the system of Abraham, and it's manifest in the church and in Israel on this planet. And I believe that both Israel and the church are at the place God intends them to be at this time. But then there's this other system, Babylon. And the Babylon system, I believe at this time, is starting to exert itself. I want to stop here and just tell you what's in my heart. I believe that there is a change happening in our world. And if I say it's a prophetic change, I don't even know what that means, because as I said at the beginning of the study, I believe that this has been prophetic going all the way back to Noah. But it is a change that is going to require an opposite change in Israel and in the church. Babylon is stirring itself in our hour, and you can feel it. You can sense it in the rebellion and how that it is going against anything and everything of Israel and the church. When I became a Christian almost 50 years ago, I remember thinking how that people would be pleased with me, that I had left a life of confusion, drugs, alcohol, and I had become a church boy, and that I was now going to seek to live a righteous, godly life. And I thought people would be pleased with that. And I was never afraid or ashamed or intimidated to tell people. I shared my story. I shared the gospel with people, from my bosses to coworkers, neighbors, teachers, always with the feeling that I'm telling you something that you're going to want to hear, because this is a good thing. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. But we live in a time now when I tell people I'm a Christian, they want to gag. They're revulsed. They're repelled. They hate what I have to say. And somehow the winds have changed. The climate has changed. the whole perspective has changed, and that the church, the Bible, believers are looked at with disdain because the Babylonian system hates us, and they have received enough power and authority to try their best to replace us. For you see, it's the church and Israel that really brought many of the great nations to this time. But now they're saying, let's remove all of that from our history. Let's remove all of that from our mind. Let's take God out of our pledge. Let's take the Bible out of our schools. Let's take prayer away from everything. They don't even want the church talking about righteousness. We can't talk about sin anymore. And Israel, which after Nazi Germany was looked at as a oasis for a suffering people, now is looked at as a terrorist state. How did this come about? How did this turn happen? It's because Babylon has stirred itself, and it is trying to pull out in the race, if I can say that, and get ahead of Israel and get ahead of the church and establish its kingdom on this planet at this time. What do we do at a time like this? I feel so strongly that for us to get into an argument and a debate and a discussion with people about details is not only foolish, it's counterproductive. The only thing we have to fight this is prayer and the gospel. That's all we have, prayer and the gospel. And if you're not availing yourself of prayer and the gospel, you're wasting your time, brothers and sisters. Our world and the systems that have held this world together, the Judeo-Christian ethic, the Bible, the stories of the Bible that was throughout much of the world is becoming undone. And the Abraham system is becoming unwelcome everywhere and in every place, as the Babylonian system, with its false religion, its social structure, and its own economic system, which will manifest itself very soon, it's taking over, and it's pushing us literally out of the way. I've always looked at things like this. I believe that there will be great end time events that happen. But I'm not talking about prophecy tonight, so please help me to get back from that. But we are living in a time where we are sitting in the theater of future events. And in 1948, that stage began to get set. All the players are not necessarily there yet. But when Israel became a nation and God's promise became fulfilled, that set in motion some amazing things. Europe then united. For centuries, Europe was at war with itself. But the Roman Empire once again began to rebuild itself. And it's interesting that this is what Napoleon tried to do. This is what Hitler tried to do. And after Israel became a nation, it just like all the pieces were pulled together with a magnet. And the Arab nations took notice of Israel and what was going on in the rest of the world and began strong opposition. And now what I'm talking about here is the Babylonian system is becoming very manifest at our time. This is where we're at, brothers and sisters.